President Donald Trump thinks tariffs are one of the best weapons to defend America's steel and aluminum industries. He's using them to keep foreign companies from bringing cheaper supply to the U.S. market. Well, today, Ottawa took steps to ensure foreign players aren't using Canada as a backdoor into the U.S. It turns out yesterday's phone call between Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and U.S. President Donald Trump wasn't just about expelling Russian diplomats. They also talked about Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs, from which Canada is off the hook, at least for now. During that conversation, Canada promised to bolster its own borders against dumped offshore steel. The Canada Border Services Agency gets extra power to identify companies trying to dodge import duties. That includes catching those that are just tweaking or assembling products in Canada before shipping them on to the U.S. The CBSA will also look for price distortions in the exporting company's domestic market. Unions will be able to take part in trade remedy proceedings, including hearings at the Canadian International Trade Tribunal. According to President Trump, China is unquestionably the big bad wolf of the global steel industry. But it's not just steel. Last week, he hit China with $60 billion worth of broader tariffs. And today, his administration is weighing the use of an emergency law to curb Chinese takeovers. It would involve identifying tech sectors that Chinese companies would be banned from investing. The Prime Minister and the President also discussed NAFTA during that phone call. Here's White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders earlier today on how that conversation went.
Look, we want to continue to work with our Canadian partners, but at the same time, like I just said, the president is focused on making sure that it is a deal that is good for this country. He wants to be able to continue working with Prime Minister Trudeau, and we're going to keep pushing forward and hopefully have an announcement on that front soon.
To get some insight on all of these latest moves, we're joined by Howard Belloc, a former Canadian ambassador to China. He stayed behind to launch a career as a businessman based in Beijing and Hong Kong. He's now the co-founder of Packbridge Capital Partners. Sir, thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure, Peter.
I was under the impression, markets certainly gave us the impression yesterday, that there's no worries about a trade war. You listen to what's coming out of the U.S. today. When you read into this, how likely do you think it is that a proper, full-blown trade war could erupt between the U.S. and China?
Well, I certainly think we're into trade battles, if not a trade war. The Chinese will absolutely retaliate on the, in fact, they've already said they're going to, on the steel and aluminum. If the Americans put tariffs on more of their listed goods, which are going to be listed in the next few weeks, Chinese each time are going to retaliate. So I think, unfortunately, in spite of the discussions about negotiations, I think we're going to see this Damocles sword held up over the Chinese again and again and again over the next whole number of months.
We were getting the impression that everybody's kind of getting used to the idea and the functionality of what these threats of tariffs might actually, how they might play out, how they might actually work. First with the aluminum and steel, as you say, then the list that we're going to get in, I guess it's the end of next week now. But this idea that the Americans might find a provision in which they could use American law to block Chinese companies from taking over and acquiring American ones, is that an escalation in this?
Well, it's a different dimension. I mean, it was all packaged together in the announcements that came out of the White House last week. But Chinese investment into the United States, or Chinese investment into Canada, is really a very different issue than the movement of goods. A lot of the movement of goods are done by multinational companies, and it's a general trade surplus that emerges, and which is structural. And that's part of the problem with the tariff issue, is the threat to put on tariffs unless you see a $100 billion improvement in the trade surplus, and then you don't, and then you're going to put on more tariffs, because it's very, very hard to correct a trade surplus. The issue of investing in each other's countries has always been a very important part of these trade negotiations, ever since the investment measures of part of China joining the WTO in 2001. And so we want to be pretty cautious about the grounds we use for limiting investment in our own countries, because we have our companies, American companies and Canadian companies and European companies who invest in China and do reasonably well there. They have their challenges, but they do reasonably well there, and it would be a very dangerous thing if we started to get into a tit-for-tat on investment access.
You're obviously in Ottawa now, but you still run businesses in Beijing and in Hong Kong. You're on the ground there. Give us a sense. We know how this is playing out in the North American media. How is this playing out on the ground in China? How are people sort of hearing these stories and taking them in there?
Well, I haven't been there since last week, but I can tell you the Chinese are pretty nationalistic and they're encouraged to see America as a bit of a bully. And so retaliatory actions taken by their own government will receive pretty widespread support, I think. Certainly when we've seen tiffs, political tiffs or other tiffs between the United States and China in the past, it doesn't take much to generate a lot of pro-China sentiment in the society. And one of the things with the consumer being so important now in China, if a boycott of certain American brands or goods were organized, allegedly informally, it would have a real impact upon the companies that were trying to penetrate, whether it be McDonald's or KFC's, which are big players in China. So there are some real risks about having a general negative attitude towards the United States grow up in China and be encouraged by the Chinese government.
At the same time, we had, I spoke with one analyst here in Canada last week who said it's in everybody's interest to play this up. The Americans want to sound and look like they're doing something and taking a strong stand without actually impacting American consumers. China wants to make this sound like this is a disaster and that they'll have to respond without actually doing any, that both sides have an incentive to make this sound and look worse than it is without actually getting into a trade war. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I actually don't think that's entirely true. I think certainly in the United States, the administration is trying to generate the belief that this is a very, very big thing. China does not seem to date to be encouraging that attitude at home. It is taking a cautious attitude. The reaction to steel and aluminum tariffs was tariffs on $3 billion worth of goods. And when last week the United States announced their intention to put tariffs on $50 or $60 billion worth of goods. By the way, they're not $50 or $60 billion worth of tariffs. The American administration climbed down from that. And they said, we're going to put those tariffs on $50 or $60 billion worth of goods. So I don't know how big those are going to be. But until they do, China has not reacted publicly, angrily, has not painted America in a very negative way in their press. It's being reported, but it's not being abused in any way at the moment. Wait and see what happens, however. You know, if it goes badly, then it could happen.
And we'll see what happens when we get that list of measures sometime at the end of next week. Thank you very much for taking the time today, sir. It was really nice to meet you.
Very welcome.
Hong Kong-based businessman and former Canadian ambassador to China, Howard Balloch.